let's go ahead and jump in. Turn in your Bible to the book of Job. If you're not sure where Job is, if you kind of open to the middle and you find Psalms, go backwards one book. It's right before Psalms. And tonight we are going to attempt to get through the entirety of that book. So 42 chapters we're going to cover in one night, which sounds like a lot, but there's a ton of it that we can just kind of sum up and skim through. Not that there's not important information in there, not that it's not inspired, but that it is, for our purposes tonight, we can get the gist of the book of Job by skipping big chunks, all right? So let me start with a little quick intro to the book itself. So the book of Job, most scholars believe it is the oldest written book of the Bible. Now, it's like the oldest text that we have. Now, obviously, there are some, it's not necessarily telling about some of the oldest events in human history. Going to be kind of hard to beat what we've talked about the last couple of weeks, right? With the creation of the world. Doesn't get any older than that, right? But as far as written texts go, Job is likely the oldest one. And there's some debate about when Job lived. But most think it was sometime around the time of Abraham. Some think it was a little bit before Abraham. Most scholars tend to believe he was a little bit after the time of Abraham. But it was definitely somewhere between Noah, who we talked about last week, and Moses, right? He lived somewhere in there, right? But we're just going to go with just after the time of Abraham, who we're going to come back to Abraham next week. So we took a break from Genesis to go to Job for that very reason, that's kind of the timeline. I'm trying to say somewhat chronologically, and then we're going to spend a couple of weeks with Abraham because he is such an important figure, and so we wanted to cover Job first and then do Abraham. But Job was likely they say he's from the land of Uz, which likely there's two schools of thought here. Either that's kind of the southern Israel / Jordan area in today's terminology, today's geography, or it was somewhere maybe the northern part of Israel, kind of in Syria. So one of those two geographical areas, we don't really know for sure, but it's not really pertinent to this story. We also, as an interesting fact for us, it is possible that Job wasn't actually his real name, that it was more of a nickname. The name Job means persecuted or the persecuted one. And so it's possible that Job's name, he gets this as a nickname because of the persecution or the destruction that he lived through, and that's how he ends up with this name. Similar to how we see Satan mentioned in this book. When we see Satan mentioned here, Satan's name has a definite article in front of it. Ha-Satan, the Satan. Satan is a word that means accuser. So when we see Satan mentioned here in this book, we see throughout the Bible that Satan has other names that he's called as well. Satan may not be referring to a proper title or a proper name as much as it's referring to a descriptor or a function rather than that, or a role rather than that proper title. Now, just because some people have taken that to mean that because it's a descriptor, that Satan is the accuser, and so you got the accuser, and then you have the persecuted one, that we are to take the book of Job as an allegory, right? That it's not real, that it's just something that we kind of have pieced together, and we can use it as a great story that fits to our own lives, that we are the persecuted ones, and the accuser is out there to get us, and all of this stuff happens, and we find ourselves in the middle of Job's story, and I don't think that's being a good interpreter of God's word. I think we can look at other places like Ezekiel 14, James chapter 5, where they use Job's name, specifically indicating that the biblical writers believe that Job was an actual historical person. And as much as I would like to think, sure, it'd be great to think that Satan isn't real, that the devil isn't an actual being out there. That would be an amazing thing, right? I don't think the Bible gives us the precedent to say that. I think it's very clear that both Job and Satan are very real beings. And so we're going to take that as our framework for the book of Job, that this was a real person, that this actually happened, and there are some lessons that we can learn from it, but it is not written as designed in such a way to be an allegory for your life or for my life, okay? So let's just walk through things together here and just see what we can learn as we go through this. The first thing to note is there is this guy named Job, and he is a very respectable individual. So let's look at the first couple of chapters, and we'll set the scene as the author does for us here as to what is happening and who are the characters in this story. There was a man in the country of Uz named Job, and he was a man of complete integrity, who was feared by God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His estate included 7,000 sheep and goats, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large number of servants. Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns having banquets at their homes, and they would send an invitation to their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And whenever a round of banqueting was over, Job would send for his children, and he would purify them, and he would rise early in the morning to offer burnt offerings for all of them. Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned, having cursed God in their hearts. And this was Job's regular practice. So a couple of things to note about Job, this character that we're introduced to here. One, he was a man of integrity. Some of your translations may say he was blameless or he was righteous. And I like the way the CSB renders this. He's a man of integrity because it conveys the imagery, the heart of what we're wanting to get out of who Job is without having to deal with the issues around giving him that title blameless. Like, is he blameless? Does that mean he never sinned? Does that mean he's a perfect human being? Well, no, because he was a human being, right? Job, he was a flawed being just like all of us are. So it doesn't mean he was sinless. He was simply blameless. He was a person of integrity. God didn't have anything against him because he was a good person who followed God's rules, who you can see from time and time again where Job is faithful. He is abiding by what God has done, what God is telling him to do. He is staying true to the Lord. So he is a man of integrity. He is blameless. He was also a man of immense wealth. He had 7,000 sheep. Now to us, we don't really speak in that language, right? It doesn't compute with us because that's not how we measure wealth, right? Today we go, hey, look at that person. He's a millionaire. That means a lot more to us, right? We don't look at someone now and go, hey, I heard that guy's got 3,000 camels. Right? We don't do that. That doesn't make sense to us. But in that time frame, which is one of the reasons why we think he's probably a contemporary in the same kind of time frame as Abraham, because in that era, that was how they measured wealth, right? We see that with Abraham, that's how his wealth was measured, by his livestock. And so we see this with Job as well. So he was a man of immense wealth. He was also a family man. He had 10 kids, 7 sons and 3 daughters and a wife. And he was also a spiritual man. And now we don't get any details about him in the upbringing of his kids, but by the time this story is told to us, his kids are grown adults and they're having their own homes and their own banquets. And in the middle of that, when they would have these parties, Job would hear about these parties, and then the next morning he would go and make sacrifices to the Lord on behalf of his kids. There's no telling what my kids did last night, God, but I'm sorry for them, right? And we kind of laugh at it, but at the same time, this is a good reminder for those of us who have adult children. Job did exactly what every single one of us with adult kids ought to do. When your kids are no longer within your direct reach, or they're no longer under your immediate influence, they don't just do what you tell them to do anymore, right? Those days are gone. Job did what every single one of us ought to do in those moments and take them before the Lord and pray for our kids, because a lot of times that's the only thing we can do. But that's what Job did for his adult children. So he was a spiritual man. And then in verse 6 through 12, we see that there is this heavenly conversation that takes place. A very interesting thing that we get introduced to here, right? Verse 6 says, one day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. And the Lord asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming through the earth," Satan answered him, "and walking around on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil." And Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the works of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand, strike everything he owns, and he's going to curse you to your face." "Very well," the Lord said to Satan, "everything he owns is in your power. However, do not lay a hand on Job himself." So Satan left the presence of the Lord. What an interesting story we get here, right? The sons of God. Remember, we talked about that phrase last week in Genesis. And I told you guys why Max's theology was wrong on that, right? You guys remember that? Just kidding, Max. But the sons of God here means angelic beings. And so these angelic beings, including Satan himself, have to come before God, and they're giving an account for what they are doing, for what is going on. And so one thing to remember in all of this, for however difficult your life may be, for however much evil you may see happening in the world, Satan is still accountable to God. He is submitted to God. He does not get free rein to do whatever he wants. God is ultimately the one in control. And he's roaming about the earth, walking to and fro on it, which leads us to believe that he is not omnipresent either, right? Satan can only be in one place at one time. So let me just maybe hopefully encourage you a little bit. When you think you're being attacked by Satan, odds are you're probably not. Maybe by one of his demons or something, right? But Satan himself probably has bigger fish to fry than you and me, right? So hopefully that's maybe in some weird way kind of encouraging to us that Satan himself isn't attacking us. But anyway, this whole conversation is happening in heaven. And then God says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's nobody else like him." This is so interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, I'm not sure exactly what God is meaning by this. Like, some people think God is kind of bragging on Job a little bit here, right? That Satan has given an account. He's going to and fro on the earth, and God knows what that means. He knows what he's been doing. And in the middle of that, God goes, "Well, have you seen Job? Dude's the best I've got. He's not listening to anything that you're saying. He follows me. He trusts me more than anybody else does. Ha!" And then the other part of me goes, man, if I was Job, I'd be like, "God, ixnay on the aimnay. Don't bring me into this. Don't put me in his limelight. Like, don't aim him toward me. I don't want Satan paying attention to me," right? So thanks for that one, God. So I wonder how Job might have interpreted this had he known any of this was happening, right? So we have this encounter where God is doing this for whatever reason, and some people believe that he is in fact commending Job's faithfulness. That it's bragging, but a right kind of bragging that God can do. You know, that he is telling Satan, for all of the evil that Satan has been up to, that there is a faithful one. There is one that Satan has not been able to touch, and that God is proud of how Job is living his life. But then there's also the possibility here that this is God initiating a test to show the resolve of Job, to show the faithfulness of Job. And that was all the window that Satan needed to jump on the opportunity and to fulfill his name of the accuser. And he begins immediately sending out these accusations. He calls into question Job's motives. Like, well, of course he's following you. Look how rich he is. You've given him everything. Who wouldn't follow you for all that kind of stuff? Right? And we understand that. If our new church policy was, when you become a member of G6 Church, I write you a check for $100,000. How fast do you think we'd grow the church? Right? Who wouldn't want to come someplace when they're getting something out of it? right? That makes sense. And that's Satan's point. And I think he's right on that. Yeah, when God's giving you stuff, we all love God. We all love that part of things. When things are going well, man, it's great. But as soon as something bad happens, who's the first person we accuse of not being there for us? Who's the first person we look to and go, why didn't you do something, God? Satan's on to the way humans operate. He knows that we look at this and think, man, God is great when he's showing blessing to me, when he's waving down all of these good things on me. He's great. Of course, I'm going to follow him. Life is peachy. But Satan knows, take that stuff away, and we're far less amicable to the ways of God, right? So then we get in the next few verses here, we see that Job ends up having a bad day. And I mean a very, very bad day. It says, and one day, a servant comes to him and says, hey, I was just out here, your family's having a banquet, and some bad people came along and they took all of your camels. You no longer have any camels. And then another servant comes in and says, hey, I was over here and they took all of your livestock. And so he has 4 different servants come along and tell him that in sequence, and it says, while he was still talking, another servant came in. And while he was still talking, another one came in. And while he was still talking, another one came in. So the first 3 servants come in and tell him all of his livestock, which means all of his wealth disappeared instantly. Can you imagine getting a call? Now, I don't know. I'm not sure what the exact exchange rate is from camels to U.S. dollars. But I don't know that any of us in this room are as wealthy as Job was, but can you imagine getting a call from your accountant or from the IRS and they say, we regret to inform you that you no longer have a paycheck. You no longer have a retirement account. You no longer have an annuity. You no longer have health insurance. You no longer have anything that is of monetary value at all. We've taken every bit of it. We wouldn't respond very well to that, right? But that's not the worst of it. The 4th servant comes in and says, Job, I hate to tell you this, but your family, they were all having a banquet and they were celebrating and having a good old time, and this weird wind came along and it collapsed the entire building, and all 10 of your children are dead. I mean, we can't imagine the grief of losing a child, let alone 10 at once. This had to be information overload to Job. Job responds in such an incredible, incredible way. In verse 20, Job stood up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. He fell to the ground and worshiped, saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I don't know that any of us would have that kind of a response. The level of faith and the faithfulness and the integrity that Job displayed in the middle of such devastating tragedy, for his initial reaction to be one of mourning, but also to be one of praise the Lord. I don't know that any of us could do that. So then we see in the story, Satan appears before God again, and God recounts to him the exact same phraseology. He says, Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him. Even though you struck at him, even though you took everything from him, he still has stayed faithful to me. And Satan says, skin for skin. If you harm him physically, he will curse you to your face. And God says, okay, do it. But don't take his life. So then we see Job gets covered in boils from head to toe. And they are so painful so irritating that he's using broken bits of pottery to scrape his flesh off of himself. Miserable, right? Awful, awful situation for him to be in. And then we see verse 9, his wife says to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." To which Job says, "You speak as a foolish woman. Should we accept only good from God and not adversity?" And throughout all this, Job did not sin in what he said. What a delightful person his wife must have been, right? Like, Satan took everything from Job. He took his wealth, he took his family, he took his kids, he took his health, and he left his wife. What does that tell you? One of my favorite clips from Tim Hawkins, let's try and play it, Max, because he does it much better justice than I do, but if it doesn't work right off the bat. All right, so we'll just skip it. I'm giving Tim Hawkins credit for this, all right? So I'm not plagiarizing, I'm not stealing from him, but he says, like, how great of a person must she have been, because Job lost everything. He lost his family, he lost his servants, he lost his livestock, he lost his own health. And his wife, she didn't die. In fact, like, she's antagonizing through that. How horrible of a person must she have been for like Satan's demons to go, "Hey, Satan, there's Job's wife. Don't forget her." And he's just laughing. "I know, she's going to stay with him. I know what I'm doing. Trust me." Right? Like, she made this thing that much worse. How awful must she have been? But in spite of all of that, Job did not sin. Then we see in the next part of the story, which is the largest chunk of the book, we see Job's friends show up. Now, Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, which is either a really great indie rock band name or a law firm, one or the other, they show up, it says, to comfort him. And when they initially show up, they see how, from a distance, they said they couldn't even recognize their good friend Job. And so seeing how distraught Job was, they began tearing their clothes and throwing dust in the air and making this big spectacle. And then they sit down with Job for 7 days and don't say a word. How weird must that have been? Like, I'm trying to put myself in Job's place here, and some horrible tragedy strikes, and I'm sitting at home mourning, and I look out my window, and I see Mario and Aaron pull up into my driveway, and they get out, and Mario's ripping his shirt off, and Aaron's grabbing mulch out of my driveway and throwing it up in the air, and like, I don't know these people. Go away, right? Like, this is not friendship. That's not what friends do. This is weird. And then they just sit down in my living room for a week and never say a word. Get out of my house, you weirdos, right? Like, this is not okay. I don't understand what's happening here. And then they begin to speak. And it's worse than their intro. Like, it would have been fine if that's all they had done and just been there for their friend, but instead they decide to open their mouths and show how stupid they were. Here's what happened. I'm going to walk you through just a summary. Now, obviously, this is very compact, and there's a lot more to their individual stories, which you can read throughout the whole 34 books in the middle of the story, right? But Eliphaz is kind of the voice of experience, right? So he starts out really soft and kind of sympathetic, but the more he talks, the more aggravated he becomes and the more accusatory he becomes. He kind of speaks as someone who's relying on personal experience to explain things to Job. He kind of presents himself as this calm and this really thoughtful person, but he really leans on these traditional ideas about suffering. And he ultimately suggests that the reason that Job is suffering must be because he has some hidden sin. That we only suffer because we've done something wrong and it's God's punishment on us. Bildad is kind of the defender of tradition. Bildad comes at this with kind of this ancient wisdom and as the foundation of his argument. He's a little more blunt than Eliphaz was, and he's a little less sympathetic as well. But he insists that it must have been Job's children that sinned, that they deserved to die, and with them all of Job's possessions, because it's all in the family. Job got kind of what was coming to him because of his children. And then our third character here, Zophar. Zophar was the harshest critic of all of them. In fact, he took that a whole nother level and said that absolutely this is your fault. This whole thing is your fault, Job, because you've kind of touted yourself as this righteous person. Clearly you're not, because this kind of stuff doesn't happen to righteous people. So I think you've maybe been embellishing a little bit about how righteous you were. You haven't been telling us the truth, and now the truth has come out that you're not as good as you claim to be or as other people say you are. What a great set of friends, right? I would much rather have Mario and Aaron tearing up my front yard than having friends like this, right? So that's what we get from these three characters. And then God has finally had enough in chapter 38. These guys have rambled on and on and on, and Job responds to them throughout there, and there's kind of these long conversations. But then by chapter 38, God's had enough. God steps in, and God begins to talk. And he doesn't give Job direct answers, because kind of the overarching theme behind this and what the three friends are trying to do and where Job is trying to get to is an answer to the question of why is this happening? And so when God speaks, we as the readers perk up because we want, okay, God's going to tell us now. He's going to tell us why all of this bad stuff happened. And God doesn't do it. He doesn't explain why this took place. Instead, God gives multiple examples of what he has created, of what he has made, and how no one else can do those things. He talks about the sea, and he talks about the rain, and he gives a lot of animals, the examples of animals that he created, and each one's uniqueness from the unmatched strength of a hippo to the stupidity of an ostrich. And by the way, that the ostrich is your kiddo's favorite one. Whitney talked with them about the story of Job last week and told them that God said that he made the ostriches stupid, and they couldn't believe that it actually said that. But it does. The ostrich is a stupid creature. There's 4 or 5 verses that God gives to it here. That God's like, where were you when I made these birds that they would spread their wings out wide and try to be horses? But they're so dumb they don't even know where they laid their eggs. And then sand comes up and buries over the top of them. And by the way, that's where we get the phrase, bury your head in the sand. Ostriches, we used to think it was misappropriated to mean that they would bury their head in the sand, to think that if they couldn't see other creatures, then other creatures couldn't see them, and they were hiding. But that's not actually what ostriches were doing. They're looking for their eggs because they laid their eggs, and then sand would come and cover them up, and they couldn't find them. And so ostriches would walk around and stick their heads in the sand looking for their eggs, and we took that to mean that they were hiding from things. No, they're just stupid. They would lay their eggs and sand would come, or they would lay their eggs and people right in places where people would walk on them and crush them. What's God's point in all of this? Where were you when I made this silly creature? Purely for my own enjoyment. And where were you when I made the hippopotamus? The strength of which is unparalleled. It's the most dangerous land animal in the world. Alligators won't mess with hippos. Those dudes are tough. And God says, where were you when I made those? Or where were you when I made these? Where were you when I did all of these different things? Job, his whole point in this is saying, Job, you're not wise enough to determine even the gestation period of a deer. You don't know when they're going to have their babies or not. You're not strong enough to contend with a hippo. You're not creative enough, Job, to make something as silly as an ostrich. You're not fierce enough to wrestle with a crocodile. You're not attentive enough to tell the eagle where to find its food. You're not brave enough to tell the horses where to find their courage in a stampede. You're not commanding enough to bend the will of a donkey. And if you can't do any of those to any one of your fellow creatures, Job, what makes you think you can contend with me who created all of them? You don't stand a chance of even beginning to get to a level where you can comprehend the complexity of the creation that I have made. Which, frankly, guys, is a much better answer than a simple, why did you let this happen, God? Don't even pretend like we are in a place where we can understand the complexity of God's world. And what gives Job, or us for that matter, the right to presume an answer to God for our ultimate question of why? We don't like to hear it, but the truth is the book of Job is a beautifully poetic reminder of our own insignificance. It reminds us that we don't get to ask God why. Or better said, that we are in no position to insist upon an answer. But then we get to Job 42, the final chapter of the book, and we see that Job is ultimately restored. Job humbles himself before God with a very incredible phrase that we're going to read here in a second, but his fortunes are restored in double portions. So now instead of 7,000 sheep, he has 14,000 sheep. He now has 6,000 camels, and all of his livestock doubled beyond what he originally had, except for his children. Guessing 20 children may not have been a blessing, right? 10 children was enough. But so God gave him 10 more children, 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. And it says that his children were beautiful. The women, his 3 daughters, were the most beautiful women in all of the land. And he gave part of his inheritance to them as well. So he had an incredibly rich family life after this. But look at verse 12 of chapter 42. So the Lord blessed the last part of Job's life more than the first. He owned 14,000 sheep and goats, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. And he had 7 sons and daughters. And he named his first daughter Jemima, which I hear was a really great aunt. His second, Keziah, and his third, Karen-Happuch. No women as beautiful as Job's daughters could be found in all of the land, and their father granted them an inheritance with their brothers. He lived 140 years after this and saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. Then Job died old and full of days. Job went through this incredible experience, and we were talking a couple of us before the service about how long this whole thing played out, from that day when those servants came in and told him he had lost everything to the day when Job is restored here in chapter 42. And we don't know how long that time period was. But after this event, he lived 140 years, right? And so we look at this whole story and we find it to be a fascinating story for sure. But there's a couple of key takeaways that I want us to draw from this as we study it. 4 of them to be specific. Number 1, suffering isn't always about sin. Let's shed the way of thinking of those 3 friends that say, if something's going wrong in your life, it's because you've messed up and God is punishing you. With the caveat that there may be times that is true. right? You can't do stupid things and not expect consequences, right? If you sin and God has designed the world in such a way that there are consequences for your mistakes, right? So don't be an ostrich and bury your head in the sand and go, well, I haven't done anything wrong, and so, all this bad stuff that's happening, the pastor told me don't look at it as a result of sin, so it must not be that I've done anything wrong, so I'm just going to keep going. No, you've done something wrong. You've been stupid. Stop doing that, right? That is a possibility. But what Job reminds us is that not every trial that you face, not every difficulty in your life is the direct result of sin. Sometimes stuff just happens. But in every case, it can be used as a trial to test your faithfulness to God. So avoid assuming that suffering is always the result of sin. Number 2, God is sovereign even when life feels like it's out of control. God's speeches here at the end of the book remind us of his wisdom and his power and his authority over all of creation. And here's something that's really interesting. That heavenly scene, that conversation that we looked at the beginning, if you removed the second half of chapter 1 and part of chapter 2 from the book of Job, how much more confusing would this whole story be? But that's exactly where Job himself was. We get the benefit of seeing that conversation take place, and so we know, because God has given Satan permission to test Job in this way, that all this bad stuff's about to happen to Job. So we can kind of mentally prepare for it. Job did not have that advantage. Job had no idea that conversation was taking place. And I think this is an area where we can make a correlation between Job's life and ours. We don't know what heavenly conversations are taking place about us. We don't know where God is permitting us to be tested or not. So it tests our faith when we go through these trials to rely on what is happening around us and what we understand and know about God and his character. And therefore, we ought to trust his character even when we don't understand his plans and what's happening around us. Number 3, faithfulness in suffering honors God. When we can be faithful in the middle of our difficulties, that is the message that the book of Job wants to send our way. That Job refused to curse God, even when his wife told him to refuse to curse God. It highlights the power of steadfast faithfulness. So in difficult times, however difficult they may be for you, worship God for who he is, not just for what he gives us. And then number 4, comfort requires presence, not platitudes. Job's friends, I think in a lot of ways, caused more harm than they did good by offering this poor theology and this judgment and these accusations about their friend. And I give some allowance for the fact that it is difficult for us to know what to say to a friend when they're going through something, right? I'm a pastor. I deal with that all the time. Right? That's a big chunk of the work that a pastor does, is helping people walk through some of the most difficult days of their lives. And honestly, it can be very difficult to find words to say in those moments. So I get that. But let me encourage each one of us to take what we see from these 3 friends and let that be a reminder to us that offering platitudes of, well, God's ways are higher than our ways, or we just don't understand why God does what he does, and maybe God's trying to test you with this, and all of that may be true, but in the moment, when your friend is at their most vulnerable and their weakest point, offering things like that just simply aren't helpful most of the time. But your presence is. Being there for your friend is. So when others suffer, I want to encourage you to focus on listening. I want to encourage you to love them and to pray for them and with them rather than explaining or trying to fix things or self-orienting. What do I mean by self-orienting? I talked about this a couple weeks ago. We have a horrible problem of always making everything about us, right? Man, I understand you're suffering. I understand what you're going through because I've experienced the same thing, or I experienced something similar to that. You've already turned it and made it about you. Your friend doesn't care that it's about you because they're hurting, they're suffering. It's about them. Don't fall into the trap that the law firm clan did here, right? Keep the focus on them. Listen to them. Love them. Support them. Encourage them. Don't turn it back to make it about you. So just a couple of practical and helpful tips for us as we walk through this incredible book. And if you have not read the whole book, I get that it gets a little tedious sometimes with some of the speeches that the friends give. But go back and read the whole thing, and you'll pick up on a lot of these themes that I'm talking about, and you'll see how all of that plays out. And God can use that to prompt you in your life as you deal with these sorts of things.